I hope we don't get a cop-out like we had last year when we had to pay out on 2 winners. The money this year has been for Caryl Shields, has been backed down from 3-1 to 9-4 favourite, and for Tibor Fischer, who's been strongly backed by most of the members of his family, I believe, from 12-1 to 4-1. I personally think that one of the books that's had no money at all on it, Michael Ignatieff's Scar Tissue, 7-1 chance has as good a chance as any.
My personal favourite, which is for purely personal reasons, is Caryl Shields. I think The Stone Diaries is a wonderful book, and I met somebody in Canada last month who spoke so warmly about it that we rushed off and bought it, and now I agree with her, it's marvellous, so that's my favourite.
A very even list to me. I think probably the best book is the David Malouf, Remembering Babylon. The most amusing, and the one I like best, is the Tibor Fischer, Under the Frog, but I have a very strong feeling that Roddy Doyle with Paddy, Clarke, Ha 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 must be high on the list of potential winners.
If I had to say who'd win, I think perhaps Caryl Shields, though I have a hunch that Tibor Fischer might sneak through with his frog.
I do hope David Malouf will win. I think he's a very fine artist and has been writing major novels for a long time, and this book has that kind of really sharp, clear, fine, poetic quality, which I like a good novel to have.
Caryl Shields' Stone Diary was the book that impressed me most, and I very much hope it'll get the prize. That's what I would back.
Well, all along I've been saying Roddy Doyle. I think Caryl Shields might. It's a wonderful novel. But if I had to put my money on someone, it would be Roddy.
Welcome to the Late Show's coverage of the 1993 Booker Prize for Fiction, coming to you as ever live from Guildhall in London. You've just heard a cross-section of opinion from guests arriving earlier for tonight's dinner, which, as you can see, is still in progress. In just under 50 minutes, this year's winner will be announced by the chairman of the judging panel, Lord Gowrie, the former Arts Minister and now chairman of Sotheby's. With the publicity and prestige of the prize comes a cheque for £20,000. But before the winners announced, we're going to hear from the shortlisted authors, and Sarah Dunant will be discussing the books with our own panel of judges, who this year are right here at Guildhall.
Good evening. In order to be eligible for the Booker, you have to be British, Irish, South African, or a member of the Commonwealth, and have published a novel in the last 12 months. This year started off with 111 entrants. Now there are 6, and by 9 o'clock there will hopefully be just one, the winner. This is the Booker's 25th year, and to celebrate their quarter centenary, they last month picked the best of all the winners, a Booker of Bookers. That title went to Salman Rushdie for his 1981 novel Midnight's Children, already recognised worldwide as a modern classic. But Booker's 25th year hasn't all been back-slapping and celebration. 5 weeks ago, when the shortlist was announced, it was met with the customary howls of outrage. The accusations this year ranged from the general, the list was narrow and middlebrow, to the specific, that it had quite simply missed the best, and certainly the biggest novel of the year, Vikram Seth's epic, A Suitable Boy. In a moment, there will no doubt be even more disagreement when our own panel, Tom Paulin, poet, critic and writer Germaine Greer, and former Booker judge Victoria Glendinning, get their critical hands on this year's shortlist. But first, back to Tracy McLeod and this year's contestants.
Sarah, in case you can't see from your isolation tank over there, Guildhall is filled with big names from publishing, politics and the media. They include Ben Ockrey, who won the Booker Prize in 1991 for The Famished Road. The writer Margaret Drabble, who's currently working on a biography of Angus Wilson. Other guests include the writer P.D. James, the Heritage Minister Sir Peter Brook, publishing mogul Sonny Mehta, and publisher Tom Mashler, who was responsible for setting up the Booker Prize in 1969. Sitting among them are the 6 shortlisted authors. In less than an hour, one of them will be richer by £20,000 if the judges don't split the prize again, as they did last year. So here are this year's contenders. Roddy Doyle was born in Ireland in 1958. He broke through from cult status when Alan Parker made a hugely popular film of his first novel, The Commitments. He's been shortlisted before, in 1991, for The Van. Paddy Clarke, Ha Ha Ha, is his 4th novel, and the bookmakers have it at 5-2. Tibor Fischer was born in Stockport to Hungarian parents in 1959. Earlier this year, he was selected as one of Granta's best of young British novelists. Under the Frog is his first novel, and the bookies have it at 4-1. Michael Ignatieff was born in Canada in 1947 of partly Russian parentage. A former philosophy lecturer, he's a journalist and historian, and of course, a regular presenter of The Late Show. Scar Tissue is his second novel, and its price is 7 to 1. David Malouf is from Brisbane in Australia, and now divides his time between Sydney and Tuscany. In addition to novels, he also writes librettos for opera. Remembering Babylon is his fifth novel, and is looking good at 7 to 2. Caryl Phillips was born in St Kitts. He came to England when he was 3 months old and was educated in Leeds and Oxford. He too is one of Granta's best of young British novelists and is currently a writer in residence at Amherst College, Massachusetts. Crossing the River is his fifth novel and is the rank outsider at 10 to 1. The only woman in this year's shortlist is Caryl Shields. Born in Chicago, she's lived in Canada since 1957 and has only been published in Britain relatively recently, despite being well known in North America. The Stone Diaries is her sixth novel, and the bookies make it 9 to 4 favourite.
Thank you, Tracy. Well, the Booker judges have, of course, already made up their minds. Our panel in the Guildhall studio here is about to begin. With me are the writer Germaine Greer, the poet Tom Paulin, and the biographer and critic Victoria Glendinning, who last year was sitting at the top table in Guildhall as chairman of the judges. Unlike the Booker judges, we around this table now have a strictly limited amount of time to make our choice. As an introduction to each of the books, The Late Show has talked to the authors, well, 5 of them anyway. The first 2 titles up for discussion are the 2 comic novels on the list, Roddy Doyle's Paddy Clarke, Ha Ha Ha, and Tibor Fischer's Under the Frog. Following the massive success of The Commitments, The Snapper and The Van, Roddy Doyle's latest novel, Paddy Clarke, Ha Ha Ha, stays in the fictional Dublin suburb of Barrytown, but goes back in time to tell the story of 10-year-old Paddy Clarke.
It's about the world seen through a 10-year-old boy in and around 1968, which, worryingly enough, is the same age I was in 1968, but I didn't realise this until I was actually doing the second and third drafts of the book. When I was putting it together, it dawned on me that Paddy Clarke was exactly the same age as I was. And it's written in the first person, so people would assume, I think, it's autobiographical, but it's not.
The record player was a red box. He carried it home from work one day. You could pile 6 records on it over the turntable, but we only had 3. The Black and White Minstrels, South Pacific, and Hank Williams, the King of Country Music. When he brought the record player home, we only had 1, South Pacific. He played it all Friday night and all the weekend. He tried to make me learn I'm going to wash that man right out of me hair, but my ma stopped him. She said if I ever sang that in school or outside, they'd have to sell the house and move somewhere else. It played 33s and 45s and 78s. 33s were LPs like the 3 we had. Kevin smuggled his brother's record, I'm a Believer, by the Monkees out of his house. It was a 45. But my dad wouldn't let us play it. He said there was a scratch on it. He didn't even look at it. He wasn't even using the record player. It was his. It was in the same room as the television. When he was playing it, the television stayed off. He once put on the Black and White Minstrels at the same time they were on the television, and he turned the television sound down, but it didn't work. The singer's mouth, the black fella that sang the serious songs, was opening and shutting when the record was over. The needle was about to go up, but it didn't. It kept going over the scratch. Da had to lift it.
Under the Frog is Tibor Fischer's first novel. His title comes from a Hungarian expression about the worst place in the world being under a frog's arse down a coal mine. The worst place in the world in Fischer's novel is post-war Hungary under Soviet domination, a society in which his 2 young heroes do their utmost to subvert the system.
It's a black comedy about life under communism in post-war Hungary. It follows the fortunes of 2 young men, members of a travelling basketball team, who tour Hungary in pursuit of the opposite sex and trying to avoid work in any way. And the novel takes them from high school to the basketball team, through military service, and ultimately to the revolution in 1956, where the uprising was crushed by the Soviet army.
It was true that at the age of 25 he had never left the country, that he had never got more than 3 days' march from his birthplace, no more than a day and a half of horse and carting, or 1 long afternoon's locomoting. On the other hand, you're amused, How many people could say they had traveled the length and breadth of Hungary naked? They always traveled naked. He couldn't remember how or why this started, but it had become the irrefrenzible rule for the locomotive team as they traversed the nation for their matches. They always traveled in their luxury wagon, custom built by Hungarian railways for the Waffen-SS to facilitate them in their Europe-wide art looting. And they always traveled naked.
Right, well, let's begin with 10-year-old Paddy Clarke. Tom Paulin, this is Roddy Doyle's second time on the list. Is he going to make it with this one?
I don't know. I couldn't speak for the judges. It's a very interesting novel. It's very enjoyable, promotes good feelings, but there's a kind of adult misery buried in it of the parents' marriage breaking up that never really gets looked at. So you're drawn again and again to the foreground of bits and pieces of childhood experience and knowing behind that the parents' marriage is breaking up, but that's not faced, so that it runs away from its real subject, which is an adult subject.
Its power is dialogue, of course. The book is substantially dialogue. He's very good at it.
Terrific dialogue, marvellous, and this lovely relaxed sense of Irish English and the spoken language. At the same time, I have to say that this is a novel set in Dublin. What's happening in the north of Ireland just doesn't percolate through at all, except the Northern Irish football team. There's no sense that somewhere else in the same island there are terrible things happening, and I worry about that. I think the nostalgia is overdone.
Well, of course, he is only 10. It's his 10-year-old consciousness.
Yes, that's true.
Victoria, if you were now chairman of the judges this year, would you be rooting for this afternoon?
I don't know. I'm very glad I read it. I enjoyed it very much. I think that it does tell you exactly what it's like to be a 10-year-old in the late 60s, early 70s, in that Dublin North Side, which in fact I know very well. But that's all it tells you, I feel. What else does it tell you? There is no plot as such. It's rather episodic, cumulative, and you can justify the fact that we don't know as much as an adult reader would like to know about the parents breaking marriage, in that we can only know what a 10-year-old knows. And in that way, I think that Roddy Doyle is in a way evading, by remaining in the child's world, making it possible and justifiable not to write about the pain.
Jermaine, at some level, a book about little boys can also be a book about men. Is it at all a study of masculinity?
I think the whole point about it is that the little boys' lives are like a mad epic full of insane adventure and forcing themselves to experience all kinds of things for no very good reason. So it's rather like the Iliad in a way. You've got all these little heroes making themselves day after day, confronting impossible challenges, and behind them, like the gods, moving in an inscrutable way, are their parents in their agony, which the children can't understand. I think it would be totally wrecked if anybody understood it. The thing I find so important is that it actually reminds you, it's not even a revelation, of the way little boys are. And suddenly you understand lots of things. You understand hooliganism. You understand how this overrides in this sort of masculine bonding setup to make these little boys do bizarre things. But it actually begins with putting the lighter fluid inside his little brother's mouth and setting fire to it, and it comes like a dragon, and the child can't speak thereafter. I mean, what do you people want from a book?
Let's end on that image. All right, let's move on then to the second kind of comic novel, maybe that's a strange term, which is Tibor Fischer, this look at post-war Hungary. Tom, how was it for you?
It was like being stuck in a sweaty changing room. It was like being asked to read a jockstrap. It was awful. I'm afraid. It's his first novel. I feel bad saying it. I couldn't stand it. I loathed it. It bored me to death. These basketball players talking about women the whole time as they wandered over Hungary. It was desperate.
You didn't find it funny at all?
No, never. No, it's not funny.
I think I may be reading a different book. I had a sort of vision of those films of the 70s that came out of Czechoslovakia, that kind of bittersweet quality. Jermaine, did you laugh?
The thing is, it thinks it's a lot funnier than it is, and that's a bore. Also, the problem is that the worst chapter is the first. the editor should not congratulate herself on that. It's so badly written, the first chapter, that it's unbelievable. It has one of the worst sentences I've ever seen in print. I think it's on page 16.
Don't quote it, Jermaine, just carry on.
I can't remember it, actually. But it is intolerably masculinist. Women occur in the book as sort of a stray nipple glimpsed in an exam. But the writing picks up in the second episode, which goes right back to 44. And the spirit behind all of that is really not Tibor Fischer, I think, but the kind of mass consciousness of the Hungarian expatriates, who are some of the wildest people I've ever met in my life. I can remember when they hit Australia. And that is quite wonderful, except in a way its anti-communism is just a bit too pat. And as for ending up with the John le Carré ending is impossible. It's
Well, let's talk about that ending, because black comedies do have to be serious at some point, Victoria, and it is a very serious ending, isn't it?
It is. I think you could say there's a difficulty that it starts as comedy and ends up black. But I think it's very refreshing to have a non-revolutionary hero of a revolutionary novel. I mean, he's so flippant, so casual, so uninvolved. You know, when the guns are actually shooting in the streets, he goes off saying, I think I've had enough of current events for today, you know. I think it's ludicrous to expect 1990s political correctness in 1940s and 50s Central Europe. I mean, that is simply how men would have talked and thought about women.
And we should also note that a first novel is hard work to get on a Booker shortlist with a first novel.
It's an incredible achievement, and I think it's right that it should be there. I did enjoy it a lot.
Great, okay, well those were the first two. Let's move on to the next two books on this shortlist. Both of these are historical, and both in their own ways are concerned with notions of race and identity. They are Caryl Phillips' Crossing the River and David Malouf's Remembering Babylon. Caryl Phillips' Crossing the River is a novel about 3 children sold into slavery by their father in the 18th century. Using the license of fiction to travel time as well as distance, their 3 stories move from 18th century Liberia through to 20th century Britain.
Well, to a certain extent, what I was trying to achieve with this book was to reclaim, or to attempt to reclaim, the whole notion of slavery as something we can talk about and discuss without notions of guilt entering into it. I think for too long, people have looked at slavery as something which one ought to feel either guilty about or ashamed about, depending on whether one is a European or one is an African. My real, I suppose, desire in writing this book was to hopefully liberate slavery from those rather, reductive adjectives and enable us to see the sort of multiple ironies, the acts of compassion, the acts of generosity, sure, the grief and the sorrow, but also, in the end, the redemptive triumph, I think, that went with slavery. People survived. The nature of the globe as we know it today has changed because of slavery.
For 250 years, I have listened to the many-tongued chorus, and occasionally, among the sundry restless voices, I have discovered those of my own children, their lives fractured, sinking hopeful roots into difficult soil. For 250 years I have longed to tell them, children, I am your father. I love you, but understand there are no paths in water, no signposts. There is no return to a land trampled by the muddy boots of others, to a people encouraged to war among themselves, to a father consumed with guilt. You are beyond, broken off like limbs from a tree, but not lost, for you carry within your bodies the seeds of new trees, sinking your hopeful roots into difficult soil.
David Malouf's Remembering Babylon is set in the Australian outback in the 1840s, where an English boy, Jemmy Farley, brought up by the Aborigines, comes to live among European settlers. His new life not only disturbs the Europeans' notion of race and identity, but also his own.
The air he breathed here did him no good, the food too. The ground he walked on jarred at every step. The land up there was his mother, the only one he had ever known. It belonged to him, as he did to it, for the whole of time, since it was for the whole of time that it existed, as he did too, so long as he was one with it. This was what the blacks had brought him, in case he needed it. They were concerned that in coming here among these ghostly white creatures, he might have slipped back into the thinner world of wraiths and demons that he had escaped, though never completely, in his days with them. They had come to reclaim him, but lightly, bringing what would feed his spirit. I really wanted a figure in the book who would be familiar with Aboriginal culture, but again could not translate it, couldn't find words for it to the people he is now confronting. And so in many ways Jemmy's silence is the kind of proper silence of that culture in relation to our culture. That was one thing. The other thing, it seemed to me to be a much more scary thing for fairly powerless, poor, inarticulate white people in an utterly new area of Australia like that, to be faced not with blacks, but with someone who seems to be like them but is not like them. That is somebody who has entered completely into that landscape.
Victoria, let's go on to the Caryl Phillips first there. In some ways, this is probably the most ambitious book on the list. It's trying to paint us a different portrait of slavery in, 239 pages. Does it succeed?
He set himself something really very difficult, like ventriloquising men and women from different periods, everything from the mid-18th century to the mid-20th century, people of different ages and cultures and races. And I think he brings it off fairly well, but with one, to me, disaster which spoils the book, which was when he enters into the voice and the person of the British, white Yorkshire girl with whom one of the black soldiers becomes involved. It's not right. The idiom's not right. The words used aren't right, even though it's well researched as far as artifacts and what was in the newspapers is right. It's not right. And yet his impulse was totally generous to say the deprived, the underprivileged, the dispossessed, whatever colour they are part of this lost family of love, which the father at the beginning is. So it's a beautiful impulse that, in fact, spoils the book for me.
Well, if the book's going to work, it has to work through all of those voices, Germaine. Did it work for you through them?
No, I'm afraid it didn't. I found the beginning and end sections about the peccant father unbearable. The crops failed, I sold my children, oh please. That's not how people lose their children in slaving situations. It's not that simple. And I thought that the ventriloquising really didn't work for the earlier sections. I thought the sort of Hawthorne imitation was all over the place. The diction kept slipping and sliding every this way and that. I didn't believe the Faulkner bit. I didn't believe Martha in her doorway and that whole... I didn't believe that either. The imitation of the Journal of the Slave Trader was fine as far as it went, and then it suddenly became a different book. And it was somewhere in England. He was hedging his bets, but novelists always do. And I thought that character came alive, Joyce.
The very character that Victoria hated,
Except that I don't really think of Joyce, I'm afraid, as a white woman. After a while, I began to think of Joyce as a black homosexual who was in the hands of a white sadist. Well, there are such things even in Sheffield.
Tom?
Yeah,
mediate here between these two voices.
I agree. I thought it was kind of decent, adequate, but it didn't interest me. It's written in this very static standard English. The language has no energy. The story has no energy. It falls apart. Good try, but it doesn't get there.
All right, OK, well, let's move on then to the David Malouf Remembering Babylon, this rather poetic tale of European versus Aboriginal sensibilities. I'll come back to you, Tom. You're never the gentlest of critics. Do you like this one any more than you've liked any of the others?
Oh, yes, it's a wonderful novel. It ought to win. It's terrific. I mean, it comes centrally out of the great tradition of the Australian novel. It's got this visionary, grotesque quality. It's beautifully written. It's very subtle. It's a marvellous book, yeah. It's great, yeah. It's outstanding. But nobody seems to be talking about it. I suppose it's not going to win. But I really loved this novel. I mean, I can see it's got certain faults towards the end. It gets a bit fragmented. But it is a most marvellous, beautiful novel.
I can't believe my ears. We have a clear winner here from Tom. Germaine, a clear winner for you too.
No, this book makes my heart pound with anxiety because I really hate it. And I hate it because it is well written in a way. It's like a great sort of luxurious duvet, only underneath there is nothing. I really resent the creation of the black-white man, white-black man, because you can express all sorts of racist feelings about him with impunity, because he's not real. He's so unreal, he's unbelievable. And as for inventing that preposterous past for him burning the rat catcher and all of that, I found that impossible. But the worst thing is that children in Australian primary schools know more about black people than Malouf does in this book. Now, it's not good enough for Malouf to say, oh, I'm imitating the settlers. They didn't know anything about the blacks either, and I'm no wiser than them. He is just as stupid as they are when he's talking about Jemmy in situations where the white settlers have never seen him. The assumption of a sort of lumpen race of blacks, the reference to, oh, it was near the black hunting ground, the black woman who didn't know her way around the country. I mean, children can tell him what hunter-gatherer people are. I think this book is really insidious, and colonialists will adore it.
OK, Victoria, put yourself back a year. You've got your two judges here. One loves it, one hates it. What do you do? Where do you come in?
I liked and admired it very much. I'm not Australian, and I'm faintly in love with Australia, so maybe there's something there. I thought it was it reminded me very much at the beginning of Darkness Visible, that strange Golding novel, you know. And in fact, it is a bit like that. But what I loved about it was the way nobody in that novel is at home. The settlers aren't at home. They're trailing Scotland behind them. The Jemmy is obviously between two cultures. The Aborigines are threatened and watching from the bush. I love the way how there are very poetic descriptions of the bush, of nature, of plants, but they're never in a vacuum. They're never for their own sake. It's always what somebody sees, how this particular person sees it, and you know why. The map is different for every person. And there's a wonderful set piece of a girl being overwhelmed by a swarm of bees that cover her, every inch of her, so that she is the beast.
Is nothing moving
Even
you
inaccurate
here?
about
Is
bees.
nothing moving you
She's
here?
supposed to be menstruating. That's the point about that bit.
I don't give a damn whether it's accurate or not. It's
No,
a
I know. It's
wonderful piece
magic
of writing.
unrealism. It's even worse than magic realism, in my view.
I thought that particular part was a bit overdone and a bit sort of overly poetic and dwelt on, but it tends to dwell on itself a bit too much towards the end.
The real facts behind that story of the settlement of inland Queensland are so tragic and so terrible. To reduce them to this sort of impressionistic flirtation makes me choke.
But
I
he
can't
was telling
bear
just
it.
his story, this little bit of Australia.
Oh,
He's not
whose
trying
story?
to write the
But
great
whose
Australian
story?
novel. It's quite a short book.
Well, somebody else said it was in the great tradition of Australian novels.
Well, I was
Yeah, well, it was me. Yeah, I thought so. I mean, if you start from
Life,
you know
which
Marcus,
is a great Australian novel, is so
it's a great
dry and so self-mocking that this piece of rhetoric...
Oh yeah, it's not comic like Such Is Life. It's
Clearly,
not comic
we are not
like
going to
that.
agree around this table. It would be interesting to see whether this kind of discussion went earlier this afternoon on the Malouf. That brings us now to the last pair on this year's shortlist. Both of these books are by Canadian writers, Caryl Shields' The Stone Diaries and Michael Ignatieff's Scar Tissue. Caryl Shields' The Stone Diaries uses the form of a fictitious autobiography to tell the story of Daisy Goodwill, an ordinary Canadian woman. It chronicles her life from birth through marriage, childbearing, middle age and death.
I wanted to write about a woman whose life more or less approximated the life of this century. So I went back to 1905 in Tyndall, Manitoba, which is a limestone quarrying town. And that's where Daisy Goodwill begins her life. And it's a life that many women in this century have lived. In a sense, she's an individual, but in a sense, she stands for, I think, a lot of other women who, in fact, had their voices taken from them and who were, in effect, given very few choices.
Maybe now is the time to tell you that Daisy Goodwill has a little trouble with getting things straight. With the truth, that is. She had a golden childhood, as she'll be happy to tell you, her loving adopted Aunt Clarentine, her adoring Uncle Barker. Warmth, security, picnics along the river, a garden full of flowers. And then, at age 11, finding her real father, a remarkable, everyone said so, self-made man who showered her with material plenty as well as the love of his heart. Well, a childhood is what anyone wants to remember of it. It leaves behind no fossils, except perhaps in fiction, which is why you want to take Daisy's representation of events with a grain of salt, a bushel of salt.
Michael Ignatieff's Scar Tissue is about a man trying to cope with the death of both of his parents, but in particular the loss of his mother, whose mind-debilitating disease makes him question his own powers of reason.
This is a novel about illness. It's about losing your parents. It's a novel about coming to terms with those kinds of losses. It's also an attempt by someone who calls himself a philosopher to contemplate an illness that looks like Alzheimer's disease and ask himself what this tells him about the self, what this tells him about human identity. It's the philosopher watching his mother die and losing her memory and trying to come to terms with that. And it's much more unsettling and much more disturbing than anything he's ever bargained for. And it ends up messing him up. It ends up unraveling him as a person. Children are impossible, she says, and when I ask her why, she says it's because their faces are always changing, like light among clouds. Damn it, she swears softly and lights a cigarette. My father puts a beer into her free hand, and she takes a long sip while he tosses one to my brother in the hammock. Give the boy one, too. So young, my father says. I'm 14. I want to have Miles Davis's fine bones. I want to play the slide guitar like Elmore James. I want my face to stop changing, my voice to settle down into something strong and masculine. I want to be a man of few words. I want to drink. My father looks me over, then tosses me my first can, and when I open it, it gushes over my hands. I'm as old now as she was then. I can still smell the hops and feel the chill of the can between my fingers. I'm still addicted to impossible wishes. I'm still trying to remember every single instant of the days my mother painted my portrait.
Right, let's start with the Caryl Shields here. Victoria, she's the only woman on the list, rather like last year, so a lot carries on her shoulders here. And she was a lot of people's favourite at the beginning of the programme.
I'm deeply prejudiced in favour of women, but this is my unfavourite book on the whole list. There's one very good food joke in it, when the daughter says to the elderly mother who's asked where the gravy is with the meal, she says, gravy was over in 1974. It was very good, but that was the only laugh I had in the novel. I mean, the whole point of the novel is this woman who's lived her life with a feeling of terrifying inauthenticity. So she's trying to put it together from imagination and dream and history and archaeology. It seems to me School of Atwood, but without that kind of anarchic, loose wickedness that Atwood has. There's not nearly enough wickedness in this book. It's too decent by half. I object to a lot of editorialising. Things like, when we think of the past, we tend to assume, and then a little mini-essay.
Well, of course, part of the book is to reflect on the notion of autobiography and therefore reflect backwards.
To us to do, surely, by, you know...
All right. Germaine, is it too decent by half for you?
I actually found it an extraordinarily daring thing to try to do, namely to pull together by sheer power of writing, of poetic power in the writing, making it sensuous and immediate, a life that was utterly dreary, that was full of events to which the heroine had never reacted. Her husband falls out the window, doing, she doesn't react. She has a sex life, not recorded. She bears children, childbirth not recorded. Instead, her gardening column is recorded ad libitum. And it seems to me that Caryl Shields was actually saying, I'm going to make this as dull as I possibly can. I'm going to leave out all the racy bits, but by sheer power of writing, I'm going to pull it all together and make it wonderful. And she fails.
Did she fail for you, Tom?
Yeah, I thought it was camp. I mean, it was. Yeah, I thought it was like a Canadian Dame Edna Everage.
Really?
Yeah, I did.
In her kitchen
but
cupboards.
without the viciousness. And you know, Aunt Daisy's lemon pudding. You get the recipe. Then there's very snobbish about gardeners. You'd object to that, wouldn't you? She really hates gardeners. I mean, I'm not interested in gardening myself, but I thought this was just a bit beyond the pale, really, to make fun of them.
I'm going to end this here, wait a minute. I'm going to end here because we've only got one more book, and I'm revving up outsiders behind to give away this prize. We must talk about it before then. It brings us to the last book, Scar Tissue by Michael Ignatieff, a book about death, a book about the loss of self, a book about fear. Germaine, big issues. Is it a good, readable book, too?
I cried all the way through it for all kinds of reasons, but it shouldn't be a novel. He should have actually faced it fair and square and written reflections on the death of a parent and stopped farting around trying to invent significant moments where people put pins through eyes and the light streams through and so forth. Just do it. He gets to Lear, where he's been going ever since the beginning of the novel, and he can't use it because it's a novel. And he wants to engage with Susan Sontag. Can't do it. This is a novel. He has to put the scientific view in the person of a pragmatic brother, which means he buggers that up too because he can't talk about the deeply metaphoric nature of scientific thought itself. The man's an intellectual, he's an academic, he just better hack it. He is not a novelist. Stop now.
But he does put a central character as a philosopher, which allows him to play with some of those notions.
The whole thing about novels is they can't be cop-outs.
Okay.
A lot of these novels
It's not a novel, Victoria.
I don't give a damn whether it's a novel or not. I read it and I thought it was very compelling, but I wanted to argue with him all the time. I thought it was really about himself. It wasn't about his mother, even though he gives her this total devotion. It was a me, me, me novel. And at one point, I thought it was too narcissistic, and I didn't know whether the narrator knew how narcissistic it was. It was a sort of smudge of intention that worried me. Also, I wanted to argue about his ideas. He said at one point, accepting death means giving up on the idea of life as narrative. It doesn't at all. It means the narrative has an ending.
It's the essential condition of life.
Exactly. I just want to say...
All right, Tom.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, the central character introduces characters who are called my wife, my son, my mother. And you think, no, this is like one of those rather anodyne observer pieces he used to write. It begins well, it's moving, it seems to be building up to being very intelligent, and then the longer you stay with it, the less interesting, the less intelligent it becomes, the more narcissistic, till it falls apart.
And yet, interesting, we're talking about a novel that made you cry a lot.
Yeah, but that's easy. It's easy to make me cry. And I have lost a parent and I'm probably about to lose another from gradual mental decline. That's not the point, really. The thing is, he creates this mythic movement of a man whose life is destroyed by the fact that his mother had a disease which is probably properly named life. And that becomes, the more you think about it in retrospect, the more preposterous it becomes.
But it's a deeply interesting book. As a book.
Yes, we're all calling it a book. I don't think it is a novel at all.
It's an essay masquerading as a sort of stretched novella.
But that makes it a bad essay.
All right, well, like it or
yeah.
not, it's part of this shortlist here today, so it is a novel for the purposes of this discussion.
It's a novel.
Now, they're about to come up with their winner. I'd like to go around the table here now on the basis of your feelings in this discussion and tell me what you think should win and will win.
Not what they think is going to win, but what we
what
would
do you
like to
think?
win.
Yes.
Remembering Babylon by David Malouf. Because it's a perfect structure, it does exactly what it intends to do, and I enjoyed every minute of it.
Yeah, I back the Malouf, absolutely, yes. I hope it wins.
What do you think will win?
Don't know. Can't say.
Germaine.
I'd say that Roddy Doyle is the best book by far from all kinds of angles. I think it's too good for the Booker, if you want my real belief. I'd be really pissed off if it wins the Booker, because it's too good for that kind of thing.
And what will you do if the Malouf wins?
I'll have to set fire to myself. I just can't see a way out here, because it is so plausible. It sucks people in. So I'm really, the lie at the heart of it makes me more panic-stricken than it otherwise would. I feel quite desperate about this book.
Okay, we've still got about 30 seconds before they round up. Do you think it's a good list, Victoria?
I think it's a worthwhile list. Anybody reading any of these books isn't wasting their time. And they shouldn't believe any of the sort of things about all these novels are crap, none of them should be on the list. They're all good pieces of work.
Tom, you've sat through a number of lists here with me. Is this a good one?
It's okay. I worry about the Fischer being on it. I read a wonderful novel by a young Indian writer called Amit Chowdhury, a novel called Afternoon Rag this year, which ought to have been on, which was read by the judges and rejected. I'm sorry it wasn't on, because I think it should have been.
Germaine?
I guess for what it is, well, I am actually very worried about what's happening to the novel, because it seems to me that in Caryl Shields we had novelised family history. In the case of Tibor Fischer we had novelised anecdote. In the case of Ignatieff we had novelised argument. Something's gone bung here. The novel tells a story and has to establish its own kind of causation. We have lost the kind of confidence that allows us to do that. The exception would be Roddy Doyle.
Right, OK, well, there we go. We end with a critique of the novel in general. I think it is time now to learn who actually has won this year's 1993 Booker Prize. And we're about to learn that from Tracy MacLeod, who'll be introducing the chairman of the judges on the floor.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, we are just about to learn who the winner is. The chairman of Booker plc, Sir Michael Caine, will now invite Lord Gowrie to announce the judge's decision.
May I now ask Lord Gowrie to announce the winner of the Booker Prize for 1993.
Secretary of State, ladies and gentlemen, before this century is out and only 6 more years to go, anyone in possession of a telephone, a television, a cable, a dish and a personal computer will be able to shop, be educated, be entertained, communicate, invest, play games, make friends, keep in touch, all at the tip of a finger. The second Gutenberg revolution is what happens when Einstein meets the couch potato. None of these devices will cost very much, and most of us will have access to them. But electrical magic notwithstanding, I know that the book will remain with us. It may seem threatened, it won't be superseded. It's the most interactive technology there is. Because except for falling in love, books are the best method we have for entering the inner space and inner weather of another human being. And then comes that change in the weather due to the force of your own concentration as you read. So if books are no longer the principal means of exchange, they do remain primary producers of ideas and emotions. In the case of novels, and we're celebrating fiction tonight, you even reach beyond the mental space of the novelist. You get to know the characters until, like friends or lovers, they enter and alter your own life. Try doing that with an Amstrad. A book is portable as well. A word about the prize. Booker knockers have been prowling the columns and airwaves this year. They have a point, and dissent is always entertaining. Competition is arbitrary in this field. We can't use the stopwatch, and we didn't test our finalists for steroids. A winner is of course exciting, and you have only 2 more minutes to contain yourselves. It was exciting for us. I didn't know the name of the winner when I woke this morning. But with 6 different minds, luck plays its part. What we all worked at this summer was a shortlist we could unhesitatingly recommend, and our shortlist is still what matters most. There was no discussion of nationality, race, or gender. We went for books we felt might suspend your preconceptions and your personalities as much as they suspended ours. Because that in fiction is a necessary suspension, so wonder and sympathy can step in. That's where the action is. Both prize and sponsor deserve praise for allowing us to bring it to the attention of the world. As we round the last corner, a word about our panel of readers, and I call them readers, not judges. In literary criticism, you can establish rational criteria for literary judgments, but that's not exactly what we did. We were readers, bookaholics, people who choose books to chip away at our own lives, and we hope they'll work on your lives as well. I want to thank Gillian Bear, Olivier Todd, Anne Chisholm, and Nicholas Clee for conformity of purpose as strong as their independence of taste. As we come into the straight, my thanks and congratulations to a field 115 strong. There were household names, new names, unknown names, and names which define English-speaking civilization everywhere. It was a terrific entry, and that made things difficult. In the end, it came down to an Irishman, 2 Canadians, one of whom lives here, a Briton of Hungarian descent, a West Indian raised in England, and an Australian. In no significant order, because I made these notes before I knew the name of the winner. We admired Tibor Fischer's Under the Frog for gleaning humour from the darkest soil, Caryl Shields' The Stone Diaries for a new definition of a heroine, Michael Ignatieff's Scar Tissue for proof that contemplation of illness freezes neither heart nor mind, Caryl Phillips' Crossing the River for scoring history like music, Roddy Doyle's Paddy Clarke Ha 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 for the creation of Paddy Clarke himself, and David Malouf's Remembering Babylon for grounding myth in locality. This afternoon, in the face of these marvellous books, we forced ourselves with difficulty to a conclusion. The winner of the 1993 Booker Prize for Fiction, the 25th, is Roddy Doyle for Paddy Clarke Ha Ha Ha.
Taylor, my successor as chairman of Booker, to present the check to the winner.
First of all, I'd like to thank the 5 other shortlisted novelists for giving me probably the best month's reading I've ever had. I think if I had been on the panel, I wouldn't be the person up here. Nevertheless, I am, so I'd better thank the panel. It's a wonderful compliment to be paid, and I'm very, very appreciative. I don't know how you reached a decision, but from my point of view, obviously, you're very, very generous. I suspect that if you had been on the Eurovision panel, Norway would have got 1 vote. Oberon Waugh may not be too pleased that yet another foreigner has been given the prize, but I know my man Dar quite happy with the decision. There's a few people I want to thank without becoming like an Oscar ceremony. I want to thank everybody at Secker and Warburg, my publishers, and if I may home in on some people, particularly Annie Garwood, Minna Fry, Jeff Mulligan. I want to thank a great friend of mine who works as my manager in Dublin, John Sutton, who came over for the Booker Prize, but unfortunately is back at the hotel room flat on his back with that thing, a bug. So I want to send very special greetings to John. In Ireland, I want to thank Derek Spears, who gave us the photograph for the cover of the book, and I think it's an integral part of the book. I want to thank Evelyn Coyle, I'm running out of names here, Edwin Hagel, and I want to thank my father for lending me his cufflinks. There they go. Finally, there's a place on the north side of Dublin called Kilbarrack. I grew up there and I taught as a teacher there for 14 years. It is the best people in the world and a train station that stands beside the Taj Mahal as one of the architectural wonders of the world. When I started writing about 11 or 12 years ago, Kilbarrack offered me a huge, deep pool of inspiration, and I dived in and I very happily drowned. So I particularly want to thank the people of Kilbarrack tonight. Thank you very much.
So the 25th Booker Prize for Fiction goes to Roddy Doyle for Paddy Clarke Ha Ha Ha. He was shortlisted in 1991 for The Van, and on that occasion, Ben Ockrey got the prize. This year, obviously a very popular winner. Sarah.
Well, Jermaine, I needn't ask how you feel, you please?
I'm just a bit pissed off I didn't get the 4s.
The Victoria?
Well, I think, good man yourself, Roddy Doyle. I think it's great. I think what will happen to this novel now this big thing has happened, it will become like a syllabus novel, and I think a lot of kids a year or two older than the child in the book will read it, and it'll be one of those immortal books of adolescence. And go on.
Tom Pauling.
I realised as Jermaine spoke about Roddy Doyle's novel that he was going to win, and she'd got it right. Yes, I mean, I'm delighted he's won it.
Anything more?
I do think it's a great novel. I'll tell you why, because the more I thought about it, the more I enjoyed it. Whereas with the other books, they faded so quickly. I was having trouble hanging on to them. And I realised I've read it twice. I'm going to have to read it again. It gets better the more you understand the very subtle way it's put together.
Brilliant. OK, well, you can hear how popular it is back at the Guildhall. Here in the studio, Jermaine Greer, Victoria Glendinning and Tom Pauling. Thank you all very much. And don't forget that the Late Show at 11:15 tonight will feature an interview with Roddy Doyle. And from next Monday, you can see dramatised readings of his book on BBC Two every night at midnight. But from the Booker at Guildhall, good night.